David, you're a professor at the University Paris-Nanterre and in delegation CNRS here in Arizona.
Thank you everybody for joining us for this second session of the FAAD. And so we're gonna do a presentation about tipping point in socio-ecological system. It will be with, I will do the first part, mainly explaining to you what are the tipping point, and then Régis, hopefully, will be able to develop some example and present some research question, advanced research question. This presentation is based on preliminary findings of a research project with name Tipping Point and Sentinel Monitoring, Interpreting, and Managing Environmental Change in Southern Arizona. It's a joint research project between the iGLOBES and University of Arizona, with David, myself, Régis, Frédéric Keck in France, Marie Branche-Roudot, Jeremy Weiss, Benjamin Wilder, and Adriana Zuniga-Terran. It's a interdisciplinary program from biology to social sciences, even to philosophy. Frédéric Keck is an anthropologist and philosopher. And it's funded by, you may know this, International Human Environment Observatory, Pima County, which is also based here in Tucson. And it's part of a huge network of international human environment observatory. We stretch from, you get some in Canada, in South America, in Africa, and a lot in Europe also. So we are part of this network, and it's funded by, if you see on the slide, the LabEx Dream, which is a CNRS funded laboratoire of excellence. I will begin with next slide, please. Okay, I will begin with this kind of refreshing picture. It's the Pine Island Glacier in West Antarctica. It's also known as the Doomsday Glacier. And the glacier now, this glacier is slowly receding now, quite not a fast pace, but a recent study you see here, the reference of the study, it's 2021, the tipping point and early warning indicators for Pine Island Glacier. And so this recent study shows that if the melting past a tipping point, if you see in the small picture, the ridge, which is on the small picture presented here, and the melting rate, so if it's past this tipping point, the melting rate will accelerate, and this glacier, and this will have some huge consequences on global sea level rise and also climate change. And this glacier, like in Pine Island, may be one of the best example of a tipping point. And it also explains why the notion of tipping points, since maybe 20 years now, is becoming more and more popular in academic research, but also in the media. And so I will, next slide, please. I will just, in this first part, try to explain to you what is a tipping point. So three main background. We have two main background of ecosystem functioning. So complex systems such as ecosystem depend on interaction and feedbacks of negative and positive feedback. System change in response to disturbance is often non-linear. This is the main, this is the most important point when we are talking about tipping point. So cause and effect need not to be proportionate. And the third point is when a tipping point is crossed, highly disproportionate change can occur. You can see on this small picture here, it's not exactly a tipping point, but how a tipping point is working, at least when broadly defined. If we go into more details in the next slide, please. Okay, so the important point is that when the tipping point is crossed, the system shifts from one state to another state. That you can see in the first pictures on the right. So you have one state, which is regime number 1, and you have another state with regime number 2. And the shift from one state to another state is not linear, as you can see, but it's like catastrophic. And such shifts are abrupt, as you see it, and it's quite difficult to revert. So you can't go up. If you go from regime 2 to regime 1, you can go up easily. It's quite difficult to revert. And so this is the basic theoretical view of a tipping point. It has been applied, just to let you know that the main, the origin of the concept of tipping point could be traced back to the theory of bifurcation of French mathematician Henri Poincaré at the end of the 19th century, the 19th century, sorry. And it has been applied in ecosystem, for instance, in hydrology. And you have this work of William Graff in the 70s and the 80s. He was studying the small stream in southwestern United States. That's the arroyo, for you, your familiar arroyos that you see in near Tucson, for instance. And the study shows that there's two state of equilibrium for this small stream. One is aggradation, the other one is erosion, and the shift from erosion to aggradation is not linear. It's like it's going through a catastrophic change or bifurcation, as you see on the second small image here. So you go from island braided to sign, and it's a three-dimensional, so it's a little bit more complicated. That's the first one, but you have this kind of idea of a tipping point, and once the small arroyo passes a tipping point, it goes from one state to another. And this has been applied, for instance, in Southwestern America to US, sorry, for understanding the consequences of dams, because the consequences of dams are not linear, but once you cross, for instance, for a few years, you can't see any consequences, but then the river crosses a tipping point, and then you have a catastrophic change. So it's quite difficult, but you know that this notion of tipping point also been applied for understanding catastrophic change or environmental impacts. Next slide, please. So this notion of tipping point, and that is a major change in the next, let's say, 20 years. It has been applied to not only ecosystem, but socio-ecological systems. So including the social part in the socio-ecological system. And so you have the notion of social tipping point. This is quite a difficult notion. You're going to find, I put some reference if you want to have some more insight about this socio-ecological tipping point. And basically, if I talk like very roughly, it's the socio-ecological tipping point shares a lot of common feature with ecological tipping point. You have this small quantitative change triggers a nonlinear change, often irreversibly lead to quantitatively different states, so two state and abrupt change between the two state, and a tipping point between the one state to another state and an abrupt change. But there's also some differences. First, that it's quite difficult when you are a social scientist to identify equilibrium in society. So this is quite difficult, and that leads to a lot of I think research problems, that how to define a society, equilibrium in society. This is really, really difficult, and there's a lot of debates about could you say that a socio-ecological system is in equilibrium for who, for what kind of, which part of the population, and this is quite difficult for us to define. The second point is that sometimes in social sciences, tipping point is used as a metaphor, is not really is as equivalent of turning point. So in ecosystem research, turning point and tipping point are quite different. But in like say social sciences, sometimes some people use tipping point and turning point in the same meaning. Next slide, please. Okay. So just to go into more details and what we are doing and how this notion of tipping point is applying now, one important point is that you can use this notion of tipping point at very local scale, so in very small socio-ecological, relatively small socio-ecological system, to global scale. One example, you have an image here of the bighorn fire on Mount Lemmon, close to Tucson. And the question is that, is this fire, or huge fire what we have seen in Western US, are tipping point for desert ecosystem? And it's an ongoing studies here we are doing with our research project. We are also studying if climate change is a tipping point for wineries, or if also climate change is a tipping point for the small arroyos I was talking about, small rivers close to tipping points. So this is kind of small scale socio-ecological system, but this notion of tipping point is also used now at global level for climate change, but also you may be familiar with the notion of planetary boundaries, and the notion of tipping point is also really linked with this notion of planetary boundary, with the question that, are we going to pass a tipping point and then having a complete change of the climate and the way the planet is working now. So I don't know if Regis is connected now. My list.
Yes, I can't see you, Regis. So yeah, if you want to.
Because I was normally leaving the floor to Regis at this point. So Regis is not connected. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so this is a part of Regis, and I will try to do. I'm not familiar. I'm a geographer, so I'm not familiar with biology. And so the main point of this slide is that, like, as I told you before, the notion of tipping point is gaining quite a momentum in biology and also in social and human sciences. And it has been observed in climate, ecosystem, social, political, and economic ecosystem, and in individual collective behavior. So that's the point, the link between ecosystem and social social system. And you can see on this, as I was talking, you can find a local lot of scales, space, spatial scale, from great oxidation Permian to individual worldviews, and time scale also from days to millennia. Next slide, please. Okay, one of the main points about and main research project now is there's a lot of research project between ecosystem tipping point and climate and the question of looming catastrophe. You've seen in the first slide the picture of the Pine Island Glacier, the Doomsday Glacier, and in this study, like going maybe if you go a little bit into detail of these studies, that you have a question of collapse of some of these ice sheets, and then having a huge catastrophic change, for instance, for tropical coral reef also, and also not having a linear change, because now we are expecting still with a model a linear change of climate, but having a having a threshold and going to an auto state that is even a possibility if there is a tipping point. But as we will see in the next slide, please. The tipping point, and it's quite difficult to understand now the tipping point. The research is really ongoing, and because tipping point can interact across system and spatial and temporal scales, and this can be also some cascading effect. So that's a tipping point. When you cross a tipping point, then you're gonna have like more and more tipping point, and that causes like a domino dynamic. So that's a kind of difficult point also to understand how the ecosystem are linked together, and how one tipping point in one socio-ecological system is linked to another socio-ecological system. We have this, some example, Regis gave some example from Greenland to AMOC, also Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, floods, flood, and cyclone. But more and more now in the research, we are thinking that the tipping point are linked with, when you have one tipping point in social ecological system, it will have some effects on other and create some other tipping point also in other socio-ecological effect. Next slide, please. Also, one thing that's also, and this is quite important, that when you are observing a tipping point, there's no, how to put it in English, a value on it. So tipping point can be key to positive change. And if you see also in the book, which was published in 2000, and it was the first book, The Tipping Point from Malcolm Gladwell, was the first book in social science speaking about tipping points. And he says that, okay, there's also positive tipping point, and you can also see some tipping point, some positive tipping points, especially if you are working on agent-based modeling, experiment, observation, and that you can be tipped from degradation to conservation. And this is kind of very important point here, because some researchers like Hillebrand and Hart will say that we can make and cross a tipping point regarding to climate adaptation. And so if we manage to cross a tipping point climate adaptation, then it could be, we can have a much faster result in climate adaptation. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that's Otto and Al also. And this is a point I was talking about. So it's that you can have like some positive tipping point in social adaptation. The main problem is to identify this tipping point. I think like Vasily is a specialist of every warning system, so he will talk about it more into details, and we can't go into details about early warning system in identifying tipping point, which is the main problem now. And the question also how when you are speaking about social tipping point, how is the tipping point also, you have the social tipping point are not the same for each part of society. Like a social tipping point for rich people won't be the same tipping point for disadvantaged people. And this is a huge problem also for research when you are investigating social tipping point. Next slide, please.
You have 1 more minute.
Okay. Yeah, 1 more minute. So maybe we can go on this. This is an example of how you have like cascading tipping point. It's a positive tipping point, and how you can go from a bad situation and crossing tipping point from going to a nice situation. Next point, next slide, please. Okay, so we go to the concluding remarks. Climate change and biosphere degradation are so advanced now that damaging tipping point may be unavoidable, and avoiding and also triggering positive tipping point towards sustainability. So this is a very important point. Second point is that modeling is kind of out. So this is not my part. It should be Regis could answer your question about this. But you can have positive change, but it's still very difficult. And this 2 steps. First step is identifying tipping point, and the second step is trying to risk manage undesirable tipping point. And we have a lot of research to do, and that will be, and we are trying here. And when we are trying here in the small scale socio-ecological system with our team, it seems that the more we're advancing, the more we have questions, and the more it's difficult to identify this tipping point. But we are going, and we hope to having some breakthrough soon now. Thank you for your attention.